Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. Hey, Wyatt, you're doing a great job. As a matter of fact, I want to speak to your supervisor.
Well, you are my supervisor, Bill.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well, let's start the show.
Oh, don't you know, it's the Bill Arnold Show. It's Bill.
And a warm welcome to the Bill Arnold Show. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk about what happens when a storm changes your plans. Do you have a storm going on in your life? Maybe you've just gone through one and you know that plans do change. We're going to talk to Pastor David Myles and Wyatt Morrell. This is going to be the Monday afternoon mix. And gentlemen, welcome. This is going to be a great hour.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah,
I am as well.
All right, Wyatt, what are the odds that David planned the exact thing I planned for the same day? What are the odds of that?
I don't even want to try and calculate it,
Yes.
Bill. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, well, we have 30 minutes. We're going to do an hour two, Wyatt and I planned on talking about Acts 27 today, and that's what David shows up with today is Acts 27. So this should be a good hour.
It should be.
This is as much show prep as I've done for, I guess, that I had no idea what he was going to talk about. So get us started, David.
Well, the question is, have you ever had a plan that made perfect sense and then this thing with 4 letters called life started happening?
More than once.
More than once.
For me.
Indeed. Me as well.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, like what happens when, life kind of, throws you a curveball or throws you a storm. And things kind of get, your apple cart gets more than upset, and I don't know about you guys. I know sometimes I began to try to wonder and figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this thing called fear that kind of comes into plan, when our plans actually stop working because we're kind of like, okay, now what are we going to do? Like what? Okay, I thought this, and now it's a question mark or it's an unknown. And it kind of brings us to today's passage. Is, Paul's on his way to Rome to meet with Caesar. He's actually going there for, his trial with Caesar. And, they had a destination, an itinerary, a journey that was all planned. And they got behind on their plan to leave in Acts 27, verse 13. But they continue to press ahead with their plan. And, Paul has some helpful reminders for us, and God's Word has helpful reminders for us when life doesn't necessarily go according to our plan. It doesn't mean that there's not a plan, and it may just be that we don't see it or understand it at the moment.
I do find it interesting that Paul, being a Roman citizen, had some legal protections, and if he was going to be tried in Judea, he wouldn't have gone well. So he formally appeals to Caesar. So that's why he's on that ship to Rome. And yet it's even God already told Paul in Acts 23:11, you must also testify in Rome. So it's interesting. Paul wasn't really just merely trying to save his own skin. He already had a message from God.
Yeah.
Pretty powerful.
That is really powerful, And, coming into Acts 23, it's in Acts 21 that he's, in the courtyard and some people say, oh, here's this guy who is causing all this problem and he brought a Gentile into the temple. And like they literally had to call in like everybody to spare him because the people were ready just to take him out.
Yeah. And the fact that the storm, David, is not taking Paul off his path. The storm is happening to Paul while he is in God's plan. And I think that's something that hit me on the head. It's like, of course, the storm is happening while Paul is in God's plan, because that's what happens with us. The storms in our life, this is God's plan. even though we don't like it.
We're exactly where he wants us.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. And sometimes, truth be told, we don't like it.
That is so true.
We don't necessarily like storms, but storms are a part of life.
And we can't control storms, and we like to be able to control things. As control freaks, we like to be in control.
Yeah, and I mean, like, there's some things in life that, you feel pretty comfortable with, and then there's some things that feel kind of outside your element. And I remember one time I was in North Dakota, I was out biking, and I was, going on a long cycling ride, and the weather turned unfavorable. And then it started, thundering, and then it started lightning, and the winds were whipping up, and I'm in the middle of a field, and I'll tell you, I was praying because I was just like, oh my goodness, this is like, I'm in the middle of, and I'm watching lightning strike around me. And
Is this in the book or is this the movie version? This sounds like a movie, doesn't it?
Well, it felt like a bad movie. It definitely was definitely a prayer time because it was. I mean, I was a good chunk of miles away from my destination.
Wow.
The weather had turned really bad, and I mean, I was pretty alert. When you're driving and you're seeing lightning and you're hearing thunder and the wind is blowing and you're not sure, what's about to happen, if you're going to have a tornado, a storm, something like that. But I did bike myself, and I definitely had a good conversation with the Lord, because like in a storm like that, you have no control.
Yeah, and the storm was very real, and your circumstances looked less than ideal, but you were praying and trusting and having hope, which a lot of people don't have hope.
Well, let me ask you something, David. Before that storm hit and you were on your bike, were you praying or talking to God in that moment? Like before the storm came up and the lightning's going on around you, were you having conversation with him or praying to him before that?
Yeah.
You were?
I'd been on a bike ride and I was like listening. I think this was a time when I was going through like Luke 15 and I was looking at like prodigal God and looking at the divine drama of the father's heart and looking at the younger son, the father, and the elder son. And I probably was also just kind of listening to music and jamming.
And I'm willing to guess that posture, that conversation and prayer quickly changed, though, from that to a, God, I need your protection and safety right now. I need your deliverance. I need you in this moment, correct? Because you don't know what's going to happen. And so my point in asking you that and what I'm about to say is sometimes we're put in those storms or that season of life to depend on God. It's the only way he can get our attention sometimes is to say, hey, you need to look to me in these circumstances. And that's painful. And we don't want to go through that. And I'm going through storms in my life right now. And I don't necessarily see the good in it yet, but I know that there's going to be good on the other side of that. I can trust in him. But yeah, sometimes we need to experience that or face those storms so we truly turn our attention and dependence towards him.
Yeah. And I think like one of the things I remember in a book by Lenora, I can't remember, and Elaine Yu, is a book on procrastination. And in the chapter, it talked about why it was difficult for people to make changes. And they said, if you touch your hand, there is this phenomenon called just noticeable difference. It's like if you touch your hand, you feel that. It registers at about 500 to 600 milliseconds. But they said fear registers in 14 milliseconds.
Ooh.
So by the time you recognize fear, it's already hit you as a stimulus and is already gone, And so there is, like, in that storm, knowing God, but still having like real fear. Like this is like, wow. I mean, like some people say, don't scare me with heaven, but I was definitely like concerned about the weather. And I definitely was talking with the Lord. I was like, God, this is something, and my little legs were carrying me as quickly as possible. And I was like, I'm on this little bike and get struck by lightning. That's going to be, I might actually end up with an afro then. It just would be momentarily, just a crispy one. So, but all I have to say is even the fact of knowing the Lord, like you say, why we can find ourselves in situations where our reaction, our response is fear. And it's that fear of the unknown.
Right? It's good.
And I guess before like going on this, sometimes people feel they'll feel like, they'll kind of beat themselves up on it. And one of the things that's really interesting about fear is in Genesis chapter 3, after they eat the fruit, God is walking through the garden and he says, Adam, where are you? Like God knew where he was at. And Adam said, what? I hid myself because I was afraid. So one of the first negative emotions besides shame introduced in Scripture is fear. And you see constantly the disciples and even us in our lives experiencing fear and Jesus showing up. Do not fear. It is I. Don't let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe all. So all those various ways that Jesus would show up and he'd speak his peace to us in the midst of our fear, it's also taking the time to be quiet and even to listen, even in the midst of a storm.
Fear's a pretty complicated subject.
It is.
Jesus calms the storm, and they were afraid because of the storm. Then Jesus calms the storm, and now they're even more afraid. Who is this? Even with Jesus in the boat, they're afraid.
And
their fear doesn't go away.
These aren't just like, chill, kind of happy. Like, these are like fishermen.
They know the seas.
They know the seas.
Yeah.
So this is like no, and so when they're fearful, that's something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what happens in the story with Acts 27 as well. They hit a storm, and it just grows in its intensity, because in chapter 27, verse 12, it talks about how they weren't able to reach the harbor of Crete because they were facing a southwestern and northwestern type of wind. And then in verse 13, it says, now when the south wind blew gently, okay? But then you get to 14, it says, but soon a tempestuous wind called a northeaster struck. And then as you continue to go through the passage, it's like, they had this horrible storm, and basically they're throwing everything overboard.
Yeah, they had gone days without seeing the sun or the stars.
And I love that Acts is honest enough to say at the end of verse 20 on that part, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest laid on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned.
Wow.
Pretty desperate situation. A lot of people listening have felt the very same way, maybe as early as today. God bless you if that's you.
Mm-hmm.
If you are in that kind of dire situation where you don't feel like you have hope, or you don't feel that there's a solution, because God is the solution, and he will be, and he will come alongside you, whatever you're going through right now. Just trust as best you can, because like I said a little bit earlier, this storm wasn't taking Paul off of the path that God had for him. The storm was happening while Paul was in the middle of the path that God laid out for him.
And that's where I think it's important to go back to Scripture, too, in these moments where you feel like it's hopeless and you've abandoned that idea of hope or that something can come from this. And one of my favorites that I've memorized is Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your path. If you think about the situation they're in, they haven't seen the sun or the stars. If they're trusting themselves and what they know and what they can see, well, yeah, of course, all hope is going to be abandoned in that situation. But if you trust in God and you have full belief that he is on the throne and in control, even when it looks bleak, he's going to make your path straight and you'll get through to the other side one way or another. I don't know what that's going to look like depending on the situation you're in, but you can be comforted by that truth, knowing that he is on the throne and you can trust in him.
Mm-hmm.
David, you bring up a great question, and the question is, it's not how do I keep my plan from falling apart? Maybe it's who am I when my plans fall apart? That's a great question.
It is, because unbeknownst, in life we kind of God's gifted us the ability to sometimes categorize things. I can't remember the exact number, but I think like we have some 5 billion neurosynapses really a day. Like our brains are super, super active. And so it's overload. So sometimes for good and sometimes for not so good, we can truncate things down into more, categorical ways to kind of go with things. And so unbeknownst until like God kind of kicks the props out, or when you're in a situation where everything's not, you don't realize how many different things you find your identity in. And even good things. And it's like, who are you without all of those labels?
It's a question I think we all should be asking ourselves and taking very seriously.
We've seen it all around us. We see accomplished athletes, and when their career is over, they don't know who they are. Or a business person who's been very successful, and then they leave the company, and then they don't know what to do anymore. They're not as important in the eyes of. They don't think they're that important anymore, and they start to crumble.
Yeah. A lot of people think what they do or what you're doing is who you are. And, there's a big, big distinction there between the two, who you are and then what you do. So.
It's interesting in our culture, though. I mean, like, especially, this is with all people, but this does happen with guys, that usually one of the first questions that they're eventually going to get to is, so what do you do? And so there's so much, we swim in a soup of expectations, or sometimes a sludge of expectations, and we don't even realize it. And so we can find our identity in things like, being son, husband, father, pastor, teacher, co-host, athlete, scholar, bookworm, gardener, all these different things like that. And it's when we begin to lose those things, or when those things actually begin to change in our life, like there's a real kind of, okay, who am I?
Yeah.
I mean, like, who am I? And I mean, like, and I want to, have a place where we can be real, because sometimes we're asking that question knowing all of the theological right things. I was at a men's prayer event at the beginning of the month, and we were talking about some things, and I brought up the thing that God help us to not just be theological Christians and practical atheists. I mean, Wyatt, as a teen, I remember people writing Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your understanding, and all his ways acknowledge him, and you will make your path straight.
Yeah.
You realize how hard that really is?
Oh, yeah. If you actually, it is one thing to say that and to write it down on like a shoe or in your Bible or somewhere, but to actually live it out, that's a whole nother thing. Absolutely.
Yeah. And
you write stuff on a shoe?
Some people do, like an athlete, for example, like a Bible verse on a shoe, or like a wristband. That's where I was going. I didn't explain it very well. But.
No. But that's the statement you're trying to live out. But it's a very hard one to live out.
Yeah, it's easy to write it down.
Gotcha.
Or for me to come on this show and say it. But living it out, as we know, Bill and David, completely different.
Amen to that.
Whole another story.
All right, we'll take a short break and be right back with the Monday afternoon mix. Pastor David Myles, Wyatt Morrell, and I will continue our discussion of when the storm changes your plan. We'll be right back. When you text FAITH to 41224, you'll be sent a series of text messages over the next few weeks. Each message will provide you with resources that explain the promise Jesus makes and what a relationship with him can look like. Explore more about who Jesus is and what he taught. Text the word FAITH to 41224. We're back with the Monday afternoon mix. Pastor David Myles and Wyatt and I talking about the dramatic story of Paul's voyage to Rome as a prisoner. And it seems like, if you think about it, it feels like there's a big shipwreck story in it, and there is. But there's something much deeper than that.
Yeah.
I mean, You can have the ship lost, but don't confuse that with your life.
And I think it's actually maybe important here to just kind of give the context, because we know context, without context, you can proof text, without proper exegesis, people can do eisegesis where they want to add things in. So I'm just going to read briefly these verses. So Acts 27:13 starts off, it says, "Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed for Crete close to the shore." So earlier, they're trying to get to their destination. These guys have a plan. They want to get there. And Paul actually says, guys, we shouldn't do it. So in verse 14, "But soon a tempestuous wind called a northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Calda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground onto Syrtis, they lowered the gear or the anchor, and thus were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands." Verse 20, "When neither sun or star appeared for many days, and no small tempest laid on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned." Verse 21, "Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and he said, 'Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail for Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart,' or the RSV says, to keep up your courage, 'for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told, but we must run aground on some island.'" And so this is kind of the context of what's happening. Paul's on a boat with, I think it's about 275 other people, and they're heading up, and they have their itinerary. And this storm happens. And what do you do when the storm isn't just like a couple hours? I don't know about you guys. I've had moments where I've been like, okay, Lord, this has gone on for a good spell. And it continues to go on. And that's the part, like you say, why, will we still trust God when we don't get to trust the time frame? We don't get a call, on the time frame of how long this is going to be.
Right. You may embrace it for a little bit. You may be like, okay, I'm going to make the best of this and figure out what it is God's trying to teach me. But then to your point, week goes by, a month goes by, a year, whatever it may be, and all of a sudden you're more than just a little uncomfortable and you're thinking, okay, God, what is it you're trying to teach me right now? Yeah. What is going on? And in their case, I would imagine that they thought, like we talked about earlier in that first segment, all hope was lost. It was looking pretty bleak. They thought they were going to lose their lives.
Yeah, and I mean, there's sometimes even where we're kind of cool with it. I mean, for myself, I've been on a journey for the last couple of years that God has been working and doing things in my life. And I remember even a year ago, just having a period of just, prayer and fasting and just saying okay, God, I feel like I'm in this kind of refining that you're doing this deep work in me, and don't let me out of the fire until you're done. And that was cool. And I was and there was parts of it that I was totally great, totally good with. And then it's when, day 3 turns to day 4 to month 3, 4, then to year. And all these things continue to happen. And you can begin to feel is God with me? Because sometimes we confuse storms with God's goodness, meaning if I have storms, then did I do something wrong? God, are you upset at me? And it's storms are a part of life. And there's some things that we learn in these storms. Out of all the words in the Bible, this and other stories in the Bible where God showed up in storms, like you said earlier, Bill, with Jesus and the disciple. It's not so much that there was a storm. The reality is the fact that God is with us in the storms.
So when people were giving up hope, Paul does something pretty amazing. He stands up and essentially says that an angel of the God that I belong to appeared to me last night, and God told me that I must get to Rome and that everyone on this ship will survive. It's pretty amazing. So basically in Acts 27, verse 25, he says, so keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. He's not saying don't worry about the storm. It's not that bad. He's saying the storm is horrible, but God has spoken to me and God's promises are true.
Wow.
That's the word for the day. If you're in a storm, God's promises are true.
And here's what's kind of wild is that sometimes God will take you from theoretical to experiential lived experience. And what I mean by that is, like, I was living in Arizona doing an internship when I was at North Dakota State University. And I remember I was flying up to see a friend in Canada, and I flew from Phoenix to LAX. And so I'm sitting at an LAX and, getting ready to get on the plane. And at that time, there was an Alaska Airlines flight that had crashed. Well, there's this Mutual Omaha, form there. And so I started, filling this little form out. And it's like the Lord said to me, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm just kind of filling this out. He's like, David, have I not called you to preach my gospel? I'm like, yes. He goes, nothing's going to happen to you until I get you to your destination that I have for you. I was like, oh, well, that's cute. And I get on plane flights and people be like, I'm nervous. I'm like, you know what? God's got us because I'm not going anywhere. So it would be a couple years later where God's like, I'm going to take this from theory to reality. And I was living in Fargo, North Dakota with my roommates. And on a Sunday evening after church, was talking to a friend of mine. Our next door neighbor in a nice area of town had backed up his car. He left. And then eventually the guy came back. And when he came back, he walked on the door and I heard this door slam and glass break. So I'm walking up to this guy in this, shared driveway. It's evening. And I walk up to the guy and I'm just like, hey, I'm like, are you okay? He goes, yeah. He goes, I hit my head and all that. I said, okay, well, be totally, yeah, cool. Well, 75 miles away, my mom's in a church service and the service is going. And all of a sudden she stands up and she said, everybody stop. She goes, stop. And they said, what? She goes, stop. We need to pray. David's life is in danger. What happened out of this event that I would later find out because supposed to have a roommate meeting and people barbecue, but a guy had knocked on our door and said, the house next door is on fire. And I came out, and sure enough, the house was next door was on fire. That car was gone. And what happened was our neighbor had bludgeoned to death his two roommates, set the house on fire, and unbeknownst to me, I was walking up to this drug-crazed person, and I'm the one person in between him and leaving town.
Whoa.
And unknown to me, my mother is in a church service, and the church began to just pray for me. I would eventually have to testify in, court and everything. They found the person. But it was one of those things that God's like, I'm going to let you walk up on somebody, And I lived in Chicago, never had an issue. It was in Fargo, North Dakota that our neighbor, did this. And so people, wherever they're at, the heart is desperately wicked, and we all need Christ. But God was like, David, I'm going to let you come this close, unbeknownst to you, and I'm going to cover you. And I'm going to cover you in prayer. And so I remember later that night, my mom was trying to get a hold, of me, and I was at the station. I came home, and she finally gets through, and she said, baby, she goes, what's up? She goes, are you okay? I said, it's been an interesting day. And, when you use the word interesting, that's interesting. And she was like, what happened? And I told her, and she said, oh, my Lord, what time was that at? And I told her, and she said, we were in church in the middle of worship, and the Lord said, stop the service. We need to pray for you. Your life is in danger.
It's remarkable.
And God was like, you thought it was cute in LAX writing this and me telling you this, but I'm actually going to let you experience a storm. And and I'm actually going to walk and be with you in that.
Yeah. Wow. What a remarkable story of God protecting you in the middle of a storm. All right. We're going to take a short break. If you have a question or comment you'd like to add to the conversation, you are so welcome to do it on the text line, 877-933-2484, 877-933-2484. Wyatt will have us back in a few minutes. We're back with the Monday afternoon mix. Pastor David Myles and Wyatt were in Acts chapter 27 today. And so they get hit with a massive storm. Ship is being tossed so badly they have to throw all of their cargo and all of their gear overboard. And for days, they don't see the sun or the stars. I think there's a lot of people feeling hopeless. But after Paul says, no, we're going to get to Rome and everyone on the ship is going to survive, I find it interesting that there's a plan B, that there's some sailors try to escape in a lifeboat. I got my own plan here. I'm not sticking around. And then Paul basically says, if these men leave the ship, we're not going to survive.
And it is. And there's one other little piece here that we just kind of skipped over. Verse 21 says, since they had been without food for a long time. And that's kind of like, tongue in cheek, because it's almost like Paul gets petty in verse, 21, but it might really just be because he was hangry. Because he stood up and said, hey, guys, fellas, y'all really should have listened to me.
I was thinking that, too. It's almost like I told you so first before he gets to the point. Like, you should have listened, but now that you didn't, fear not. Keep courage. I have faith in God that it'll happen just as he told me. We will be saved.
Yeah, because going back to verse 8, it says, coasting along with difficulty, we came to the place called Fair Havens, near which is the city of Lazar. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, sirs, plural, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, and not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. Verse 11, but the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And like Paul said, guys, I'm like, we don't, this ain't looking good. But the pilot and the owner of the ship are like, no, we got to get there. Like, we have a plan. We have an itinerary. Mm-hmm. We have these goals. We have this, I remember a gal sharing one time, saying like, you'd go to school and it was a ring by spring of your money back, and the person was sharing about not being married, and then actually by the time they got married and then struggling with fertility and the pain of that because of saying I had this image of the person I was going to be. And what happens when it's different? What happens when there's this loss of things? And so the other important thing here is that it's not always best to follow the majority.
Right.
So true. I love the fact, David and Wyatt, that God never promised Paul that the ship wouldn't sink. He just promised that they'd get to Rome and that the people on the ship would survive. It's like, how do we survive if the ship sinks?
Yeah. We're not called to worry about that, right?
Well, no, but that's the kind of thing that is terrifying to people. I mean, the ship is lost, the cargo's lost. Journey was terrifying, but what was not lost was God's promise.
Yeah, and what was not lost was their lives.
Exactly.
Like, if we
not
think
one perished.
Yeah. And if we think through all the things in life that we've lost or we thought were losses, because sometimes our greatest gains is our loss.
That's a deep thought.
The Bible, Jesus said, he who wants to save his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for me and for the sake of the gospel will save it. It just seems like this really kind of like, what? And it's like the more they were trying to hang on to their stuff, the worse things were getting. And even in the end, they threw their stuff off. And Paul needed to remind them, you might lose all your stuff. You might lose all your things. You might lose, the old PBS documentary called Affluenza. It was kind of joking about America. Instead of us having influenza, we have affluenza. Because we can have so much things, and we can begin to feel like these things are the most important thing to us. Our house, our car, our phone, these things that happen that when we lose them, people just fall apart. Like it's the end. And it can feel that way because we are swimming in this water that says we are our possessions and our identities and all these various things other than image bearer and child of God. And so sometimes the greatest gains that we have is actually losing things.
Another deep thought, David Myles.
He's on a roll.
He kind of is. I mean, I'm not saying that's not untrue. I think it is true, but it's really hard.
It is.
Yeah, because whenever you're saying whatever you might be losing might be something God designed for your gain, that's hard to hear.
Well, I heard someone say this, that oftentimes people will build a shelf, an extra shelf, to put books that they probably really need to let go of. I say that as a bibliophile and a person at a library who's been letting go of his library. But we struggle with subtracting. I think we are often always thinking, like, if I add this to it, if I add this to the plan, if I do this. And one of the things that you find even like sometimes with entrepreneurs or a number of different things, it's actually in all the things that people say no to. I remember one of my mentors saying to a group of us, he said, I say no to so many different things so that when I say yes, the yes matters. And that I'm saying yes to the right things that God wants me to. Not every opportunity is necessarily meant for, one gentleman said, not every open door is meant that you're supposed to walk through that door, And that's where that part of discernment, and back to why it said, trusting in the Lord with all our heart, our seat of our emotion, the cardia, the heart, And it's hard sometimes because we see things with our eyes. We give Adam and Eve a hard time, but we see things and they look good to us, and we're like, hey, if I take that, I'm going to have life. And actually, in partaking of it, it can actually bring death and sadness.
The great Corrie ten Boom has a line that I've never forgotten. She said, never hold onto anything too tightly because it hurts too much when God pries your fingers open. And there's that pause.
Because that just needs to sit.
It does.
Bill, even on that, sometimes we maybe need less words, of adding of words, and more pause.
No, I don't disagree with that.
And more listen, or let me say, I need less words and more pause. And I've noticed that even as I've been going through the season and going through what I'm going through, that there's moments where I find myself in silence, just with me and the Lord. No music, working on something, no background, no white noise, no nothing, and just like sitting there. The wonderful Luis Palau, who's an amazing, evangelist. I remember him saying, if you could get people just to spend like literally 15 minutes in absolute quiet with themselves, and sharing the gospel with someone because they don't have all of these trinkets and bells and whistles speaking to them. And that's the thing that we run away from. We run away. Oftentimes we're in love with our stuff because the stuff distracts us from who we are, who we think we are, who we need to be, or all these different roles and, performas and facades and all these things that we think that we have to be. To go with the old saying, people spend money they don't have to buy things they don't like to impress people who really don't care about them.
Yeah. Mm.
So what's some stuff in life that needs to go?
Yeah, it's a great question to be asking for sure, and clarifying what that is versus what's worth saying yes to. Like you said, David, I find it interesting if you go back to verse 31 and the soldiers trying to escape, and Paul says, hey, unless they stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. And so they cut the ropes, the lifeboat drifts away. Can you imagine the chaos that's going on right now? And the back and forth and the shouting and just pure chaos. And I wonder in our seasons of life when there's a storm, just how important it is to stay calm.
Mm-hmm.
And just how important it is to take a moment and sit in that silence. Our mind can wander so many different places. And that's why they say the first thing you do if you get lost in the woods is build a fire. It calms you down. You don't do that, your mind starts to wander. You start doing crazy things you otherwise would never do. And in our storms of life, how important is that for us to do the same thing, to calm down, to sit there in that silence with God and get some perspective on it?
I think we need practice being alone with our thoughts. I don't think people like being alone with their thoughts.
But it's uncomfortable.
It is uncomfortable. That's why they put music in elevators. And if you have 2 seconds of alone time, you pull out your phone and look at it.
Yeah.
You don't want to be alone with your thoughts.
Yeah. And that's why, and I'm guilty of this as well, there are so many filler words in society now, like or okay, like. And that's because we don't like silence even when we're having a conversation with somebody. If we're thinking about what we're going to say next, we have to say or like this, or because we can't stand the silence. It's a lost art. And I think it could go a long way when you're thinking about the storms that you're traveling through, in just giving yourself some proper perspective, an opportunity for God to speak. Lean into that silence, embrace that, find opportunities to get that alone time and sit there in silence. It's great.
I think we better take a break. You're listening to the Monday Afternoon Mix. Pastor David Myles and Wyatt Morrell and I will be back in just a minute to continue discussing Acts chapter 27. Be right back.
Bill needs a minute. He needs a minute. Bill needs a minute. He'll be right back. He doesn't need an hour. He just needs a minute. And then another minute. And then he's back.
And a warm welcome. 10 out of 10 people will say you are not here by accident. If you're a brand new listener, you can request a welcome pack that includes goodies and swag and information on ways to connect and grow in your faith. This is a way for you to connect and find community. Request your welcome pack today. Text the word welcome to 877-933-2484 and follow the link or request one at myfaithradio.com.
Bill took a minute, and now he's back.
We're back with the Monday Afternoon Mix, when the storm changes your plan. We're in Acts chapter 27, which is a powerful chapter. And David, we're going to spend some time talking about maybe some things that we need to throw overboard. And during the break, Wyatt and I and you were talking all about the kinds of things we need to throw overboard. And I think pride came up and busyness came up. And what else did we talk about?
But sometimes our reputation.
Right. Identity.
That identity. And, sometimes, things can happen in life where you feel like you need to give a response. You feel like you have to defend yourself. And it's like really letting God really be your advocate and your judge and your attorney on those various things. And it's sometimes we get warped. We're thinking, my attorney, first of all, if God didn't give you the last breath that you just have, you wouldn't be alive. And if he didn't give you his planet, you didn't make it, you wouldn't be here. So the gifts, talents, abilities that you have, they come from him. So sometimes we get a little bit wrapped up in ourselves without realizing with gratitude and with humility, the things that we have come from his hand, from his grace, and things like that. Giving up our sense of success. I used to joke and kind of say, but it's actually not really a joke. I never, not never, very rarely, actually I can't really remember a time where I had a parent come to me and say, Pastor David, can we get some of the elders and some people together and, just pray? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. What's going on? Well, my child just got accepted to Harvard Law or John Hopkins Medical, U of M Medical. They got there, and just want to, pray, make sure if that's really is that really God's will?
Mm.
Now, I've had the opposite where someone's come and said, can we pray because our child feels called to be a missionary? And we're thinking, are they okay? And we need to pray, is that really what God, you think God wants? I've had the flip of that, and it's that part sometimes because we can live vicariously through our children. And sometimes parents are like, that they do, and what it is, it's outdated modes of success. The most important thing is seek first the kingdom of God, his righteousness, and let God add all those things. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and everything that's in you. That's the most important thing for us, as parents. And our greatest desire and wish would be that our parents and our children and our friends and our coworkers would have Christ, because Christ is preeminent.
David, you got some great notes, and I don't want to have the hour end without bringing up a couple. But you say the turn that Paul says, keep up your courage. He doesn't tell them nothing bad is going to happen. In fact, he tells them the ship is going to be lost, but the people are going to survive. And then you talk about faith versus optimism. Optimism says, I think this is going to work out the way I want. Faith says, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I trust God with me in it. Big difference.
Oh, yeah.
So what are some takeaways?
Well, I like this one part that says, sometimes God preserves you by preserving the plan, and sometimes God preserves you by allowing the plan or your plan to die.
That's so true. Say that one more time.
Sometimes God preserves you by preserving the plan.
Yes.
And sometimes God preserves you while allowing the plan to die.
Yep.
Which you thought, God's plans for us. Like he said, for I know the plans I have for you. And also, that's not a singular, that's a plural. We sometimes get Jeremiah 29:11, we think it's actually a plural. And that passage is actually in the midst of a bunch of bad stuff happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it's written by the weeping prophet. Jeremiah is writing this. And so sometimes, and this is hard sometimes to realize in the moment, that sometimes some things that you really want, that the rejection really is protection. There's some things, if we're honest and we look back on life, and if God would have let us be the bratty child and said, God, give me. There's some things that I can look back on life and it's like, oh God, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Your mercy and wisdom from protected. I had no clue. I had no clue.
A lot of people have had dreams die with a broken heart. And in their rearview mirror, they look back and they say, God protected me. God didn't let me go down that route. God had a very different plan for me. And at the time, it felt like life was collapsing.
Oh, it feels like life, you feel like life is collapsing. You feel like you're dying.
Yeah.
You find yourself hurting in places and crying out of places that you didn't even know. And it's like, okay, but am I going to trust him?
It's good stuff.
A closing thought you have, David, is that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is deciding that fear doesn't get to make the decision. So you're not making your decision based on fear.
False evidence appearing real. And as they find out in leadership, so many of the things that we fear actually never happen.
We can't go down that road. We're out of time.
Yeah.
But that is so true. 90% of the things you fear are going to happen never do happen. It's remarkable that statistic is
right.
So skewed that direction.
Yeah, it really is. And so I guess the closing thought for people would be, or the final line, I guess I should say, is you can lose the ship, whatever that may be, but still make it to shore, using the analogy from Acts 27. It's a good word, David.
So cling to the Lord, whatever storm you are in today. We love you and care about you and want you to know that God is going to protect you in ways you can't even imagine. but you will make it to shore. So trust in him. We're going to take a little break and then be right back. Dr. Josh Moody is going to join us at the top of the hour. Don't go anywhere. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.